Imagine lying awake every single night, not because you wanted to, but because you had no choice. The cold creeping in through your wooden walls, the fear of bandits lurking beyond your door, and the endless noise of the village, goats screaming, babies crying, dogs barking, fires cracking, and people arguing. That was bedtime in the medieval world. We think of the past as a slower time, peaceful, quiet, maybe even a little boring. But in medieval times, sleep was chaos. It didn't come easy. It didn't come in one piece. And for a lot of people, it barely came at all. There were no blackout curtains, no memory foam mattresses, no white noise machines or sleep apps. Sleep back then was something you had to fight for. And even when you got it, it didn't look anything like the 8-hour lights-out dream we imagine today. The night in medieval times was terrifying. People feared it. Night was when demons, spirits, and nightmares were believed to roam freely. And the darkness wasn't just symbolic, it was real, complete, and inescapable. There were no streetlights, no headlights, no glow of city life. Once the sun went down, the world disappeared. If you were lucky, you had a candle. If you were rich, maybe an oil lamp, but for most people, darkness, thick, creeping, all-consuming black. And in that darkness, your job wasn't just to fall asleep, it was to survive it. Sleep schedules were weird. People didn't go to bed at 10 p.m. and wake up at 6. Instead, they often broke sleep into 2 parts. Historians call it segmented sleep. First sleep happened after sunset. People would sleep for about 4 hours. Then, they'd wake up around midnight on purpose, stay awake for another hour or 2, and then go back to sleep again until dawn. What did they do in the middle of the night? You name it, pray, think, talk, even work. Some people read or wrote by candlelight. Others used that time for intimacy. Some even visited neighbors in the middle of the night. Just like that. This wasn't strange to them. This was normal. If you were found awake at midnight, no one thought you were weird. They thought you were human. But that doesn't mean sleep came easy. Not even in 2 shifts. Because everything around them was built for survival, not comfort. Beds were rough. Blankets were few. The rooms were cold, damp, and full of noise. You could be sleeping in a hut with 10 other people, family members, animals, even strangers. There was no privacy. People snored, coughed, fidgeted. Some got up to stoke the fire. Others whispered prayers to keep the demons away. And outside, wolves howled. Wind slammed against wooden walls. If you lived near a forest, you might hear the crack of branches, making you wonder, was it a deer or something worse? People were constantly tired. Sleep was not guaranteed. If you were a peasant, you worked from sunup to sundown and sometimes beyond. Your body ached. Your hands were raw. You were underfed and overworked. And yet, you couldn't sleep long. There was too much to do. If you were a woman, you might have infants to feed at all hours of the night. If you were a blacksmith or a baker, you might be working before dawn. If you were a soldier or guard, you had to keep watch. And let's not forget, illness was everywhere, a fever, a toothache, an infected wound. Any of those could keep you tossing and turning. And there were no painkillers, no sleep aids, just grit. Even the privileged weren't safe. Nobles had fancier beds, but they also had stress, enemies, and politics. Castles were drafty, full of echoes, and always under threat. A surprise raid, a poisoning, a fire, anything could happen. And then there were the beliefs. Medieval people truly believed that sleep was a vulnerable state. that while you slept your soul could wander, that demons could possess you, that witches could visit you. People hung charms above their beds, said prayers before sleeping, and avoided certain foods or drinks after sunset, all to protect themselves from evil during sleep. And let's talk about beds. Some people didn't even sleep lying down. In many cultures, they slept sitting up, propped with pillows. Lying flat was believed to resemble the position of death. People feared it. They thought it tempted fate. Also, most beds were shared. Entire families sometimes slept in one bed. And not just family, sometimes travelers, servants, or guests would share too. This wasn't weird. It was expected. This meant no room to stretch, no clean sheets, no silence. Just constant motion and breathing and shifting around you. Try falling asleep with someone's feet in your face and someone else's elbow in your ribs. In some places, inns didn't even offer separate beds, just spaces on straw mats beside total strangers. It was pay for a spot and good luck. There were no alarms to wake you, just the church bell, the crow of a rooster, or your master's shout. Sometimes people slept in shifts to guard the house. One person slept while another stayed up, then switched. And yet, despite all this, people managed. They adapted. Sleep wasn't something you got perfectly. It was something you squeezed in when you could. But what if you were rich? Surely the royals had better sleep, right? Well, so yes and no. Rich people had better materials, silk sheets, feather pillows, tapestries to block drafts. But they also had enormous responsibilities. Kings were at constant risk of betrayal. Queens had political marriages. Nobles feared revolts. And all that luxury didn't block out the same night noises. The wind, the animals, the creaks, the groans. Some kings even had guards sleep at the foot of their bed, not for comfort, for safety. And one more thing. The medieval night wasn't just dark, it was long. With no electricity, people followed the sun. In winter, that meant darkness could stretch 14 to 16 hours. Imagine trying to fill that time without modern distractions. No phones, no Netflix, no lights. So people would go to sleep early, wake in the middle of the night, then go back to sleep again. Or they might stay up chatting, storytelling, mending clothes, praying, or watching for danger. Night wasn't empty, it was active. This was a world without privacy, without comfort, without clocks, and without sleep the way we know it. And believe it or not, some historians think that our modern sleep struggles, insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night, being unable to sleep for 8 hours straight, might not be a disorder at all. They might be a memory, a leftover habit from medieval times, when 2-part sleep was the norm. When waking up at 2 a.m. didn't mean something was wrong, it meant you were right on schedule. Now let's take a deeper dive into why this 2-part sleep, or segmented sleep, actually made sense back then, and why it completely collapsed in our modern world. You see, medieval people weren't weird or broken for sleeping in chunks. They were just following the rhythm of nature. Before electricity, life was ruled by the sun. People woke up when the sun rose and slowed down as it set. When darkness fell, it wasn't just inconvenient. It was a full stop. Nothing more to do. No screens, no phones, no buzzing cities, just candles, firelight, and shadows. So naturally, people went to bed early. Like, really early. Imagine settling down to sleep at 7:30 or 8 p.m. Not because you're sleepy, but because there's nothing else to do. And guess what happens when you go to bed that early? You wake up in the middle of the night. It wasn't insomnia, it was biology. Doctors in the Middle Ages actually wrote about this. One even said that the time between first and second sleep, called the watch, was the best time for prayer, reflection, and even healing. People believed that during this time, your body and mind were more relaxed, and your soul was more open. And this strange medieval sleep schedule wasn't just limited to Europe. Evidence of segmented sleep patterns pops up in historical texts from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, too. In ancient Egyptian writings, in early Islamic texts, even in Chinese medicine, waking up in the middle of the night used to be normal. You might stir around midnight, sit by the fire, talk to your family, write in a journal, or quietly think. Some even visited neighbors or ran small household errands, all in the pitch dark. And no one thought this was strange. They embraced the stillness of it. In a way, it was kind of peaceful, a moment of quiet, away from the grind of the day. Compare that to now. Wake up at 3 a.m. today and you're panicking. You reach for melatonin, wonder if you drank too much coffee, scroll your phone until sunrise, and then feel like a zombie all day. But maybe, just maybe, our bodies are still wired like our ancestors. Maybe waking up in the night isn't broken. Maybe it's human. Now let's talk about something even more fascinating. How the Industrial Revolution completely destroyed medieval sleep. Because everything changed when the light bulb arrived. Electricity turned night into day. Factories demanded long, regular work shifts. City life exploded. And suddenly, the world started running on time. Clocks, alarms, schedules. The kind of rigid, artificial time medieval people never had to deal with. Society began expecting 8 hours of unbroken sleep. One block, no interruptions. Anything less, that meant something was wrong with you. But go back just a few hundred years, and waking up at 1 a.m. to pray, think, or even go outside for a bit, that was considered healthy. Now it's seen as insomnia. Even literature from the time reflects this. Writers like Chaucer, and even references in Shakespeare casually mention first sleep, as if everyone knew what that meant, because they did. It's wild how fast we forget what used to be normal. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about sleep environments, and because honestly they were wild. If you've ever complained about a cheap motel bed or a squeaky fan, just imagine sleeping on straw, sharing space with chickens, goats, or your entire extended family, all in one room. No mattresses, just straw, cloth sacks, maybe animal hides. And let's be clear, straw sounds cozy in theory, but in reality, it was itchy, it attracted bugs, it got moldy, and it smelled like, well, animals. Blankets. Not everyone had them. People layered up with whatever they could find, animal skins, cloaks, worn-out clothing. If you were poor, you learned to sleep cold. Now think about the noise. Medieval villages weren't quiet at night. Even without cars and machines, life was loud. Dogs barked, donkeys brayed, drunks stumbled home singing, wind howled through gaps in wooden walls, fires crackled, babies cried, people coughed, moaned, and snored like it was their job. There was no such thing as a quiet room. You had to learn to sleep through chaos. And yet, somehow they survived. Their bodies adjusted. Their sleep was flexible, adaptive, communal. Compare that to today, where if the AC hum is slightly off, or the neighbor's porch light shines through the blinds, we're wide awake and Googling how to fall asleep fast. Medieval people had no such luxury. Even who you slept with was different. Sharing beds wasn't just for married couples. It was common among travelers, servants, even monks. And in big households, There might be one bed for everyone. Mom, Dad, the kids, the baby, and sometimes even a visitor or two, all packed into one shared space. You didn't complain. You adapted. This idea of having your own private room, your personal bed, your own temperature setting, that was unthinkable. It was a dream for future centuries. And then there's the wildest part. Not everyone even slept at night. Some workers, like bakers, guards, or night watchmen, were up while the rest of the village slept. They baked bread before dawn, walked the perimeters, kept watch for fires or thieves. These night workers often had an entirely flipped schedule. They slept during daylight, napped in bursts, or caught rest wherever they could. There were no labor laws. No one cared about your sleep hygiene. And let's not forget how dangerous nighttime was. There were no police patrols, no streetlights, no security systems. Walking outside at night meant serious risk of getting mugged, attacked by wild animals, or simply tripping over something in the pitch black and breaking a bone. But even inside your house you weren't fully safe. Fires were a constant hazard. Most homes had open hearths, and an untended flame could spark disaster. So someone, usually the oldest or youngest, stayed up to watch it. It was called tending the fire, and it wasn't optional. If it went out, you lost your warmth, your light, and your way to cook food the next day. So yes, sleep in medieval times was necessary, but never guaranteed. People found rest where they could. On hay bales, on benches, under trees, in church pews, sleep was a precious, unpredictable thing. And you never quite knew when you'd get it again. In many ways, sleep back then was not about comfort. It was about survival. And yet here we are centuries later, in the quietest, coziest rooms in human history, still struggling to sleep. Maybe it's time we stop blaming ourselves and start understanding where it all came from. Let's now explore something people almost never talk about when it comes to medieval sleep: fear. Because it wasn't just noisy or uncomfortable back then. People were scared at night. You have to understand, nighttime in the Middle Ages was a different world. It was darker than anything we experience now. No street lights, no cars, no glowing phones or screens. Just the moon, stars, and maybe a candle or two, if you could afford one. And in that pitch-black world, people believed terrifying things came out after dark. We're talking witches, demons, restless spirits, wolves, thieves, even curses. In fact, many medieval folks wouldn't dare step outside after a certain hour, unless they absolutely had to. Some even recited prayers before bed just to protect their souls while they slept. Doors were bolted with heavy iron locks. Windows, if you had any, were shut with wooden shutters, not glass. And in many homes, the family dog wasn't just a pet, it was your alarm system. There was this constant fear that something, or someone, might creep in during the night, and the church didn't help. Preachers often warned that night was when the devil was most active, that sinful thoughts or dreams could open a door for evil spirits to enter, that sleeping too deeply could leave your soul exposed. So yeah, sweet dreams. No wonder people slept lightly. No wonder they woke up often. Even dreams were serious business. In medieval times, dreams weren't just random brain activity. They were messages, warnings, visions. People believed dreams came from God, or sometimes from the devil. Entire books were written just to interpret dreams. If you dreamed about fire, death, or flying, that meant something. And if you woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat, you didn't just shake it off, you told your priest. Some dreams were seen as divine, while others were blamed on eating the wrong food or not praying enough. Nightmares were considered spiritual attacks, and people would sleep with religious tokens under their pillows for protection. This fear of dreams and darkness made sleep both necessary and nerve-wracking. Now let's talk about something bizarre but true. How people literally feared sleeping too long. Yes, too much sleep was seen as a bad thing. In medieval society, oversleeping was linked to laziness, gluttony, and even sin. It was one of the 7 deadly sins, after all, sloth. Peasants were expected to rise early with the roosters. Nobles had staff waking them with the sunrise. Monks rang bells before dawn. No one bragged about getting 9 hours. That wasn't a flex, it was a moral failure. Sleep had to be earned, and it had to be balanced with work, prayer, and duty. In fact, some monks intentionally interrupted their sleep just to pray in the middle of the night. They believed God favored sacrifice, and waking to pray at 2 a.m. was a form of spiritual discipline. These night prayers were called vigils or matins, and they shaped the daily rhythm of monasteries all over Europe. Imagine setting your internal clock not for a meeting, but for divine conversation in the pitch dark. Meanwhile, regular folks often worked until their bodies gave out, then collapsed for a few hours, then got up again to finish chores or tend animals. This wasn't a life of rest. It was survival with snatches of rest in between. Even kids weren't spared. Children were raised to wake early and help with labor. By the age of 7, most medieval kids had chores, from fetching water to tending livestock. Childhood didn't mean long, cozy naps. It meant learning to function on limited, broken sleep. So when did anyone rest properly? Well, that's the thing. They didn't. At least not by our modern standards. Sleep was fragmented, noisy, often cold, and filled with interruptions, from animals, people, weather, even church bells. But let's not romanticize this too much. People also died from poor sleep. Chronic fatigue weakened immune systems. Cold, damp conditions caused sickness. Respiratory problems, pneumonia, and other infections were common in sleep environments filled with mold, animal dander, and open fire smoke. There were no antibiotics, no asthma inhalers, no sleep clinics. If you got seriously ill from exposure, that was often it. So the struggle to sleep wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Yet people adapted. Some took herbal remedies, lavender, valerian root, chamomile, not just for scent but for survival. These were passed down by midwives, healers, and herbalists long before pharmacies existed. Others created rituals, burning incense, saying specific prayers, wearing certain cloths or stones around their neck. In some parts of the world, people even believed in sleep demons, like the incubus and succubus, which were said to sit on people's chests during the night and steal their energy, causing nightmares or sleep paralysis. This fear of being visited by dark forces at night is ancient and universal. And guess what? Science now calls it sleep paralysis, but back then it was explained by folklore, not biology. So yeah, sleep was complicated. But here's the twist. Some historians now believe that despite all these challenges, medieval people might have actually been more in tune with their sleep cycles than we are. They weren't fighting against their bodies. They allowed themselves to sleep in shifts. They followed natural light patterns. They didn't panic when they woke up at 2 a.m. They expected it. In a strange way, they respected sleep more than we do now. We treat sleep like a problem to be fixed with apps, pills, and blackout curtains. They treated sleep like a sacred rhythm, messy, unpredictable, but essential. And maybe they were on to something. Now let's peel back one more layer. Because this whole story isn't just about when and how people slept. It's also about where they slept and who they slept next to. In the medieval world, privacy didn't exist like it does today. Most people lived in single-room homes. If you were lucky, you might have a loft or a curtain, but for the average person, the whole family slept in the same room, sometimes even the same bed. Yes, your parents, kids, grandparents, sometimes even servants or guests, all sharing space, warmth, and noise. Can you imagine trying to fall asleep while your baby sister's crying, your uncle's snoring, someone's coughing from the fire smoke, and there's a chicken literally nesting in the corner, and the bathroom not happening? You had a chamber pot, maybe, or you just went outside. That meant cold feet, no light, and a serious risk of stepping in something awful. There were no mattresses as we know them. Beds were often made of straw stuffed into cloth sacks. Over time, those sacks got moldy, dusty, and infested with fleas, lice, or worse. Richer folks had feather beds, but even those weren't safe from bugs. The wealthier you were, the higher your bed. Literally. Beds were often raised off the ground to avoid cold air and crawling creatures. Some were so high you needed steps to climb in. These beds were covered in heavy curtains to keep out drafts, and occasionally other people. But even nobles weren't immune to the sleep chaos. Why? Because in royal courts and noble households, sharing a bed wasn't just practical, it was political. Kings and lords often slept with trusted advisors, high-ranking visitors, or favored courtiers. Not sexually, just as a way of building trust, forming alliances, or asserting control. Bedchambers were social spaces, not just private ones. Monarchs held late-night meetings in bed. People gossiped, made deals, exchanged secrets, all while lounging under the covers. Your sleeping arrangement wasn't just about comfort. It said something about your status, your loyalties, your power. And yet, even with all this noise and activity, people somehow adapted. They knew how to fall asleep fast, nap when needed, and wake up ready to work. In fact, napping was respected. Farmers would rest during hot afternoons. Monks might doze between prayer sessions. Pilgrims and travelers took breaks wherever they could. Sleep was broken up into bits and pieces, not one long block like we expect today. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In some parts of medieval Africa, Asia, and even Europe, entire communities synchronized their sleep cycles. Villages would go quiet together after nightfall and rise together with the sun. But they also understood the need for watchmen. Someone always had to stay awake. This was especially true in dangerous areas, places prone to raids, wild animal attacks, or fires. In castles and walled towns, guards patrolled the walls. In open villages, someone might take turns staying up to protect the livestock. The night wasn't just for sleeping, it was for surviving. And that survival wasn't just physical, it was spiritual too. Because remember, the church ran everything in medieval Europe. And the church taught that sleep was a moral battleground. Too little sleep, you risked madness, hallucinations, or even demonic possession. Too much sleep, you were lazy, sinful, weak. Just enough sleep. Well, you better be using it to dream of heaven, not of temptation. The saints were praised for sleep deprivation. Monks boasted of rising early and suffering for God. Sleep was something to discipline, not enjoy. And if you had bad thoughts before bed, well, that could be a sign of the devil whispering in your ear. Some people slept with crosses around their necks. Others repeated chants or wore holy relics under their tunics. But here's the wildest part. Even with all these beliefs, fears, and weird habits, people in the medieval world weren't that different from us. They had stress, they had deadlines, they had anxieties. They worried about money, family, safety, purpose. They just didn't have noise-canceling earbuds or Tempur-Pedic pillows. So what did they do? They coped. They accepted broken sleep. They talked about their dreams. They leaned on each other. They used what little they had to create routines. A wooden bed, a prayer, a piece of cloth soaked in lavender, a dog curled at their feet. That was enough. They found a way to sleep, even in a world that made rest almost impossible. And maybe that's the real lesson. Because in today's world we have all the tools, all the comforts, all the options, but we still can't sleep. So maybe, just maybe, we need to look backward, not forward, to learn how to rest again, even if it means learning from a time when people barely slept at all. Now let's zoom in on something darker, because if you really want to understand medieval sleep, you have to understand fear, the kind of fear that doesn't let you close your eyes. For ordinary people, fear lived in the shadows, real and imagined. There were no police sirens, no 911 calls, no locked doors with deadbolts. If something or someone but wanted to get in, they probably could. And that meant sleep came with risk. Bandits roamed the roads, thieves slipped through wooden shutters, and if you lived near the edge of the kingdom, you had to worry about raiders. Vikings, Moors, nomadic warbands. They didn't send invitations. They showed up in the night with fire and steel. People slept lightly. They trained themselves to wake at the slightest sound. Mothers clutched their children close. Fathers slept with tools or weapons near their beds. Even in towns, things weren't safe. Streets were dark. Fires could start without warning. Drunken fights broke out in alleys. Wolves howled outside the walls. Night watchmen rang bells or shouted through the dark, not just to keep people safe, but to remind them they were being watched. And don't forget, the plague was always lurking. One sneeze, one cough, one neighbor falls ill, and suddenly your whole family might be digging shallow graves before sunrise. It's no wonder people struggled to relax. But even more terrifying than real danger was what people imagined. Medieval Europe was obsessed with demons, witches, spirits, and the supernatural. And night was when these creatures came alive. People believed demons sat on their chests while they slept, suffocating them. They called it the night hag or incubus. Today we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was a sign you'd been cursed. Waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to move, feeling a crushing weight, that wasn't a sleep disorder. That was the devil. To fight back, people filled their rooms with religious symbols. They drew protection circles, hung herbs like St. John's wort or garlic over the bed, whispered ancient prayers as they drifted off. Some wore amulets or animal bones, even bits of iron around their necks, because it wasn't just about not sleeping, it was about surviving the night. But even if demons didn't show up, people feared something else, dreams. In medieval thought, dreams were powerful. They could be messages from God or traps from Satan. A strange dream could change your entire life. Some people recorded them. Others shared them with priests. And if you dreamed of someone who had died, it wasn't just grief, it could be a warning. The line between sleep and spirituality was thin. And this belief didn't just belong to Europe. Across medieval Africa, dreams were sacred too. In many African kingdoms, dreams were used to guide leaders. Kings had dream interpreters. Whole tribes made decisions based on visions seen in sleep. Some even believed ancestors could speak through dreams, giving advice or warnings. But just like in Europe, sleep in Africa was also disrupted by fear of war, betrayal, colonizers, and internal conflict. In Asia, similar ideas thrived. In China, dreams were catalogued and studied. In Japan, sleeping wrong, facing a bad direction, resting in a cursed place, could bring misfortune. So even in the far corners of the world, sleep was rarely simple. It was loaded with meaning, tied to fear, and filled with interruptions. And yet somehow people still valued it. Because they had to. Because without sleep you couldn't survive. You couldn't fight, work, farm, pray, think, or lead. You'd get sick, you'd break down, you'd fall apart. So even in a world of fear and chaos, people built rituals to protect their rest. Some lit candles and let them burn down to track the hours. Others listened to traveling musicians or lullabies sung by mothers who knew their child might never see adulthood. And despite everything, people still dreamed of better lives, of peace, of warmth, of a time when they could sleep, truly sleep, without fear. It didn't come easy, but they held on to hope, even in the darkest nights. Now let's talk about a group that had one of the most complicated relationships with sleep during the medieval period, the monks. Monks were the original sleep hackers. They didn't just sleep differently. They designed their lives around being awake when others were asleep. Across Europe, monastic orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and Carthusians followed extremely strict rules about sleep. The idea was this: sleep was a temptation, a pleasure, and to grow closer to God you had to resist temptation. So they broke their nights up into parts, sometimes waking every few hours to pray, chant, or meditate. This wasn't optional. It was discipline. Imagine falling asleep in a cold stone room, wrapped in rough fabric robes, no mattress, no pillow, and then getting yanked out of bed by a bell at 2 a.m. to kneel on a stone floor in silence, chanting psalms in the dark. That was a monk's reality, every night, for life. They believed being awake at night made them spiritually stronger. And maybe in a strange way it did, because this lifestyle required complete control of the body and a total rejection of comfort. They used sleep deprivation like a spiritual workout, and they weren't alone. In the Islamic world, Sufi mystics also used sleep as a spiritual tool. Some Sufis trained themselves to sleep less so they could pray more. They believed the world was most still, most divine, tells Kai, in the early hours before dawn. In China, certain Buddhist monks would sit upright while sleeping to avoid lying flat, a posture associated with death or laziness. Some even used sticks or ropes to keep themselves from slumping over in sleep. Because again, sleep wasn't just biological. It was spiritual, political, philosophical. In many ways, how you slept revealed how you lived. Were you a farmer, exhausted by hard labor? A noble, pampered and safe? A soldier, sleeping in armor with one eye open? A monk, up every few hours chasing the divine? Everyone had to sleep, but no two people slept the same. And just like today, some people hated it. There are stories of medieval poets and scholars complaining about sleep, calling it a thief of time, wishing they didn't need it, trying every trick to sleep less, study more, write more, think more. One Persian poet even joked that sleep is a coward, it flees from the wise. And yet, even they couldn't outrun it forever. But here's the twist. As much as sleep was feared, interrupted, or sacrificed, people also longed for it. In lullabies, in poetry, in stories passed around fires, sleep was sometimes a paradise, a place to escape poverty, to forget grief, to visit lost loved ones in dreams. Even prisoners, locked in dungeons, forgotten by the world, often described sleep as their only freedom, their only peace. And while elites might have had soft beds and guards outside, their minds weren't always calm. Some medieval kings feared being murdered in their sleep. They built layers of security, trusted no one, And even then, they still had nightmares. Imagine being the richest person in the kingdom, yet sleeping with a dagger under your pillow, because back then anyone could be betrayed. So who really slept best? Probably not the kings, not the monks, not the nobles. But maybe, just maybe, it was the peasants who managed to grab a full night's rest under the stars after a long day's work, tired enough to sleep deeply, poor enough to be left alone, close enough to the earth to dream without fear. They didn't write the books. They didn't rule the cities, but they knew how to rest when they could, and that in the chaos of medieval life was a rare kind of wisdom. So now we've talked about peasants, monks, nobles, and even poets, but we haven't yet touched on one of the most intense reasons people didn't sleep during medieval times: fear. Not the fear of missing out, the fear of not waking up. In medieval villages, especially in the early Middle Ages, night was dangerous. There were no streetlights, no police patrols, no 911. Just pitch-black roads, thick forests, and whatever waited beyond the firelight. People believed in demons, ghosts, witches, vampires, not in a fairy tale way, as in a real way. Many believed sleep left the soul vulnerable, that in sleep you could be attacked not just physically but spiritually. So certain rituals were used before bed. Some people hung garlic or herbs at the door. Others prayed specific psalms or whispered protection charms. A few even slept with iron objects under their pillows to ward off evil spirits. And for good reason. Medieval law enforcement was weak, if it existed at all. Bandits roamed the countryside. Wolves, wild dogs, and even bears could attack livestock or people. If you lived on the edge of the woods or in a war-torn region, you never slept deeply. Many villages even had night watches, men who stayed up in shifts, walking the borders of the community with torches or spears, watching for signs of fire, raiders, or worse. Sometimes families slept together in one room, not just for warmth, but for safety. And if a stranger knocked at the door in the middle of the night, you didn't open it. Not in those times. Sleep wasn't just a break from the day, it was a gamble. And the environment didn't help. In stone castles, wind howled through the cracks. In thatched huts, bugs crept through the straw. In the cities, fires broke out constantly from wood ovens and open flames. And with no smoke detectors, good luck. Even the beds were uncomfortable by modern standards. Most people slept on sacks filled with hay, straw, or feathers. No memory foam, no adjustable bases. Sometimes you were lucky if you even had a raised bed. And yet people adapted. In some households, parents and children all shared the same bed. That meant warmth, but it also meant noise, movement. Someone always needed the bathroom. Someone always snored. Privacy didn't exist. Which brings us to another point. If you think you're not sleeping enough now, imagine trying to fall asleep next to a coughing sibling, a crying baby, and a snoring uncle, all under one itchy blanket. And yet that was the norm. Only the wealthiest had private chambers with curtains and multiple rooms, and even they weren't immune to disturbances, because walls were thin, floors creaked, servants moved, and often the streets were filled with noise at all hours. Drunken laughter, horses clattering over cobblestone, church bells ringing at odd times, dogs barking, cats fighting, people arguing. It never fully stopped. Some medieval doctors actually warned people about sleeping too deeply, not because of health, but because of vulnerability. You had to be ready to wake up, to run, to fight, to flee a fire, to protect your home, because no one else would. Sleep was a necessity, yes, but it was also a luxury, and many people, especially the poor or displaced, didn't have time for luxuries. They slept in stables, barns, under trees, in ditches, and if it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you found a way to not freeze. And yet, humans are resilient. Even with all of this, the noise, the fear, the discomfort, people still found ways to sleep. Because they had to. Because their bodies demanded it. Because even in the darkest centuries, we still dream. And somehow, despite all the hardship, medieval people built cathedrals, wrote epic poems, painted frescoes, and tilled fields, all on broken sleep and tired feet. That's wild. And now we've arrived at the strange truth. Despite all the fear, discomfort, and superstition, some people in the medieval world chose not to sleep like we do. Not because they couldn't, but because they believed it wasn't natural. See, modern people think of sleep as one solid block. You hit the bed, pass out for 7-8 hours, wake up and go about your day. That's what we're told is normal. But in the medieval world, that idea didn't exist. Instead, there was something called segmented sleep, or in some texts, the first sleep and the second sleep. People would go to bed shortly after nightfall, let's say around 8 or 9 p.m. They'd sleep for about 3-4 hours, then wake up on purpose. They'd be up for 1-2 hours in the middle of the night, then go back to sleep for another 3-4 hours before dawn. During that midnight window, they did all kinds of things. Some people prayed. That midnight vigil was considered a holy time, a moment where the veil between heaven and earth was thinner. Others used that time to think deeply, or even talk with family. It was quiet, peaceful. The fire would still be warm, the stars bright. Some would write, some read, some just sat in silence. And yes, some had sex. A lot of historical documents and even court records reference this middle-of-the-night activity, not as taboo, but as routine. In fact, some physicians recommended intimacy after first sleep, saying it was healthier, more natural, and led to better rest afterward. Weird, right? But it was totally normal then. And here's the kicker. This idea of segmented sleep isn't just a medieval myth. Historians found references to it across Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Africa and Asia. Letters, journals, even court records mention first sleep and second sleep like it was no big deal. And it didn't go away until the invention of gaslighting, street lamps, and eventually electricity. Once cities started staying lit late into the night, people stayed up longer and tried to sleep in one go to make up for it. But that's new, Industrial Revolution new. In medieval times, night was divided. Rest came in shifts. So maybe the people back then weren't just sleep-deprived. Maybe they were on a completely different rhythm, one we've forgotten. And that brings us to one more point. Dreams. Medieval people believed dreams were messages. From God, from angels, from demons, or from deep within the soul. Dreams weren't meaningless, they were warnings, visions, lessons. Some even kept dream journals. Monks would record their dreams and analyze them for hidden truths. And nightmares, those were serious business. People believed they could die from a nightmare, that it was a spirit sitting on your chest, that it could steal your soul. Sound familiar? It's where the word nightmare originally came from. The mare was a demon believed to ride people in their sleep, suffocating them. Ever had sleep paralysis? Medieval folks had an explanation for that. It wasn't biology. It was evil. To protect themselves, people put protective charms near the bed. They prayed before sleeping. They whispered blessings over children. They painted symbols over doors and windows. Because sleep wasn't just rest, it was a journey, a dangerous one. Close your eyes, and you might not open them again. So now think about this. What if the way we sleep today isn't the right way? What if our ancestors had a better system? one that fit with nature, with darkness, with the rhythm of firelight and starlight. What if the noise of today, the constant light, the screens, the stress, is why we can't sleep? And what if, in their cold huts and stone towers, they actually had a deeper connection to rest than we do? Because back then, sleep wasn't just something you did. It was something you prepared for, protected, respected, and sometimes feared. And that, my friend, is the wild truth about why the people of the medieval times lived with no sleep. Or at least not the kind we know today.